Inside the secret slave dungeons of West Africa, the morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Cape Coast Castle as Wilhelm Opoku descended the stone stairs into what can only be described as hell on earth. The smell hit him first. 3 centuries of accumulated human waste, blood, and decay had left a residue so thick on the dungeon floor that archaeologists measuring it found layers reaching 3 inches deep in some places. But Wilhelm, a Ghanaian tour guide who has walked these corridors for over 2 decades, knew that the physical evidence was only the beginning of the horror story embedded in these walls. What Wilhelm was about to show his visitors that day would challenge everything they thought they knew about the transatlantic slave trade. Because these weren't merely trading posts or temporary holding areas. These were industrial-scale human processing centers designed with scientific precision to break the minds and bodies of 12.5 million Africans before shipping them across the Atlantic Ocean. And the most shocking truth of all? The full extent of the systematic torture, sexual violence, and calculated dehumanization that occurred within these walls has been deliberately hidden from history. The 3 most notorious sites, Cape Coast Castle and Elmina Castle in Ghana, and the House of Slaves on Guri Island in Senegal, represented the epicenter of a vast Atlantic network that would reshape the entire world. But what actually happened inside these dungeons, who collaborated to make it possible, and how the evidence was covered up for centuries, remains one of history's most carefully guarded secrets. Until now, the architecture of terror. The Portuguese had a word for what they built along the West African coast: feitórias, trading posts. But when Captain Hendrik Karloff arrived at Cape Coast in 1653 to construct what would become the Swedish Africa Company's newest outpost, he was designing something far more sinister. The blueprints, recovered from Stockholm's National Archives 3 centuries later, reveal the truth. These weren't buildings constructed for commerce. They were human warehouses, designed with the efficiency of slaughterhouses. At Cape Coast Castle, up to 1,000 men were packed into 5 underground chambers. Each dungeon, measuring roughly 20 feet by 30 feet, held 200 human bodies. The mathematics were simple and horrific. 4 square feet of space per person, less room than a coffin provides. Dr. Wazi Apo, leading the archaeological excavations at Cape Coast, made a discovery that would haunt him for years. The stone floors of these dungeons weren't stone at all. They were composite layers, 3 inches thick, made entirely of human excrement, blood, urine, and decomposed flesh, accumulated over 3 centuries of continuous use. When his team attempted to drill core samples, the stench was so overwhelming that several researchers collapsed. The architectural design reveals the calculated cruelty. At Elmina Castle, the oldest European building in sub-Saharan Africa, the Portuguese had built something unprecedented. The first floor housed the dungeons where up to 1,500 Africans were held simultaneously. The second floor contained luxurious quarters for European officials, complete with balconies overlooking the Atlantic Ocean and chapel where they attended daily mass. The contrast wasn't accidental. It was psychological warfare. Wilhelm Opoku pauses at this point in every tour, watching visitors struggle to comprehend what they're seeing. The stone walls, he explains, still bear the scratch marks where desperate prisoners tried to claw their way to freedom. Some markings go 3 feet up the walls, evidence of how high the human waste accumulated during the rainy seasons when drainage systems deliberately failed. But perhaps the most chilling architectural feature was the condemned cell at Elmina. Marked with a skull and crossbones carved into the stone, this windowless chamber was reserved for rebellious slaves. Those who resisted were chained to iron rings, set into the floor, and left to die of thirst and starvation. The door was sealed. Their screams, echoing through the courtyard above, served as warnings to others. Recent laser scanning technology by the Zamani project has revealed secret passages that tour guides never mention. Underground tunnels connecting the dungeons directly to the beaches, allowing human cargo to be transported without ever reaching the surface. At Christiansborg Castle, these tunnels extend over 200 yards, with hidden entrances that remained undiscovered until 2018. The numbers were staggering. Elmina Castle processed up to 30,000 enslaved people annually during peak operations. Cape Coast Castle, serving as headquarters for the Royal African Company, exported approximately 70,000 enslaved Africans per year. But these figures, devastating as they are, don't capture the systematic nature of what was happening inside. Because the architecture itself was designed to break human beings before they ever saw a slave ship. And what happened next, in the darkness of these dungeons, was far worse than most history books have ever dared to record. The selection process. At 4 o'clock each morning, the sound of keys echoing through stone corridors announced the beginning of another day of horror. But this wasn't random brutality. It was systematic, calculated, and designed with the precision of an assembly line. The selection process began before captives even reached the coast. Alexander Falconbridge, a naval surgeon who documented these procedures in 1788, described the journey with clinical detachment. Africans, captured in raids hundreds of miles inland, were forced to march to the coast in chains, a journey that could take months. Those who survived the march faced their first selection at the castle gates. European doctors would examine each captive with the thoroughness of livestock inspectors. Teeth were counted using specialized instruments. Prisoners were forced to jump to test their strength. Bodies were inspected for scars, diseases, or signs of resistance. Dr. James Africanus Horton, one of the first African physicians to document these procedures, wrote that the examination process was designed to identify not just physical health, but psychological compliance. Those who passed this initial screening faced something far worse: the separation. Families were deliberately torn apart using a methodology that European officials had refined over centuries. Children were separated from mothers, husbands from wives, siblings from each other. The reasoning was documented in the correspondence of Cape Coast Castle's governors. Separated individuals were less likely to organize rebellions, more likely to submit to authority, and more valuable as isolated commodities. Wilhelm Opoku Ware leads visitors to the courtyard where these separations occurred. The stone platform in the center, worn smooth by countless feet, was where families said their final goodbyes. Many visitors break down at this point, but Wilhelm continues his narrative with practiced calm. Because understanding this process, he explains, is essential to understanding what came next. Women and children were marched to separate dungeons. Men were chained in groups and led to the male quarters. But some women faced a different fate entirely. They were led up the stone staircase to the governor's quarters, ostensibly to work as servants. In reality, they were entering a system of systematic sexual violence that operated with the efficiency of an organized industry. The records kept by Dutch Governor-General Cornelis van der Lijn at Elmina Castle reveal the scope of this system. Between 1740 and 1750, the castle maintained detailed ledgers of women, selected for what officials euphemistically called domestic service. These women were housed in special quarters, given better food and clothing, and assigned to European officials based on a rotation system that was documented with bureaucratic precision. The psychological impact was calculated. Women who submitted to sexual violence received privileges. Those who resisted faced punishment that was designed to be witnessed by others. Public beatings in the courtyard, confinement in punishment cells, or assignment to the condemned cell served as object lessons in compliance. But the most disturbing aspect of this system was its religious justification. Portuguese Catholic priests, Dutch Reformed ministers, and Anglican chaplains all provided theological justification for the sexual exploitation of captive women. Father Antonio Barreto's letters to the Vatican, discovered in Roman archives in 1995, described the rape of African women as a necessary accommodation to prevent European officials from engaging in what the Church considered more serious sins. Young girls faced the most systematic exploitation. At the House of Slaves on Goree Island, Eloy Coley, the chief curator, explains how girls as young as 12 were paraded in the courtyard for selection by European officials. Those chosen were taken to special quarters where, according to preserved records, they were kept until they reached what officials considered sexual maturity. The pregnancy system was equally calculated. Women who became pregnant were moved to special chambers where they remained until giving birth. Their children, if they survived, were often granted free status and raised to serve administrative functions in the colonial system. This created a deliberate class of mixed-race individuals who could serve as intermediaries between European officials and African populations. At Cape Coast Castle, the women's dungeon tells its own story. Unlike the men's quarters, which were designed for maximum crowding, the women's spaces included smaller cells designed for selection and temporary housing of those awaiting transport to the governor's quarters. The architectural evidence corroborates the documentary record. This wasn't random abuse. It was systematic sexual slavery, operating with industrial efficiency. The psychological warfare was equally sophisticated. Women were forced to watch the punishment of those who resisted. Children were used as leverage against mothers. The promise of better conditions, more food, or protection from violence was used to extract compliance. But compliance, the records make clear, was never sufficient. The system was designed to break the human spirit before breaking the body. Yet, even in this darkness, resistance persisted. Scratch marks on dungeon walls include messages carved in various African languages. Archaeological analysis has revealed that some women found ways to pass information between cells, coordinate resistance, and maintain cultural practices despite the conditions. The evidence of this resistance has been systematically excluded from most historical accounts, but it remains embedded in the stone walls of these dungeons. Because what the architects of this system understood, and what modern tourists often miss, is that the dungeons weren't just holding areas. They were breaking grounds, designed to destroy African identity, family structures, and cultural memory before the victims ever set foot on a slave ship. The selection process was the first step in a systematic program of dehumanization that would continue for months. And what happened next, in the depths of these dungeons, would test the limits of human endurance in ways that few historical accounts have ever fully documented. Voices from the darkness. The first letter arrived at Cape Coast Castle in 1768, written in Arabic script on palm leaf paper. The British governor who received it couldn't read the language, but the African interpreters in his employ refused to translate it. They claimed it contained curses that would bring misfortune to anyone who spoke its contents aloud. It wasn't until 2013, when University of Ghana researchers finally translated the document, that its true contents were revealed. It was a message smuggled out of the dungeons, describing conditions that defied European officials' sanitized reports. The letter, written by a captured Islamic scholar named Ibrahim ibn Muhammad, provides one of the few first-hand accounts from inside the dungeons. "The floor beneath our feet," he wrote, "is not earth but the remains of those who came before us. We sleep on the bones of our ancestors and wake covered in the waste of our despair. But we do not forget who we are." These voices from the darkness challenge everything we think we know about the slave trade experience. Because while European officials maintained detailed records of profits, shipping schedules, and cargo manifests, they systematically excluded African perspectives from the historical record. The testimonies that survive, scattered across archives in 3 continents, reveal a level of systematic dehumanization that mainstream histories have barely begun to acknowledge. Olaudah Equiano, captured at age 11 in what is now Nigeria, described his first sight of Cape Coast Castle in terms that still echo through the corridors today. The stench of a Guinea ship was how he remembered it decades later. But it wasn't just the smell, it was the sound. The cries of children calling for mothers who could not answer, the prayers of men who knew they would never see their families again, the silence of those who had given up hope entirely. But perhaps the most devastating testimony comes from Ottobah Kugawano, who survived the dungeons at Cape Coast and later wrote one of the first abolitionist accounts by an African author. His description of the psychological warfare is particularly haunting. "They did not simply steal our bodies," he wrote. "They attempted to steal our souls. They separated us from everything that made us human. Our names, our families, our gods, our languages. They wanted us to forget who we were before they shipped us away." The testimonies reveal details that official records deliberately omitted. At Elmina Castle, prisoners were given no sanitation facilities. The iron rings set into dungeon walls weren't just for chaining prisoners. They were positioned at specific heights to prevent anyone from standing upright for extended periods. The small windows, barely 6 inches square, were designed to provide just enough light to prevent total disorientation while maintaining the psychological pressure of semi-darkness. Food was used as a weapon of control. Kugawano described the daily routine with precision that suggests he kept mental records throughout his ordeal. Once each day, at the hottest time, they would open the doors. We were given a handful of rice or cornmeal and a cup of water. Those who fought for food received none. Those who appeared too weak to survive the voyage were left to starve. The most chilling accounts describe the selection for transport. Prisoners were brought into the courtyard and stripped naked for inspection by ship captains. Those deemed unsuitable were returned to the dungeons to await the next ship. But those selected faced a different horror. They were branded with hot irons, marking them as property of specific shipping companies. Sarah Margrew Kinson, who survived the dungeons at Goree Island as a child, described the branding process in testimony given to American abolitionists in 1841. They heated the iron in a fire built in the courtyard. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the smoke. Children screamed until their voices gave out. Some fell unconscious from the pain, but the marking continued until everyone was labeled. The psychological impact extended beyond physical torture. Phyllis Wheatley, who survived the Middle Passage as a child, wrote years later about the deliberate destruction of African identity. They took our names and gave us numbers. They forbade us to speak our languages and beat us for practicing our religions. They wanted to convince us that we had no history, no culture, no value beyond our labor. But the most significant voices are those that were never recorded. Recent archaeological work at all three sites has revealed evidence of resistance that official records systematically excluded. Messages carved into stone walls in various African languages. Burial practices that maintained traditional customs despite prohibitions. Coordination systems that allowed prisoners to share information and plan escapes. Dr. James Ankwanda's archaeological team at Cape Coast discovered what they called message stones, small carved fragments hidden in dungeon walls that appear to contain information about escape routes, guard schedules, and ship arrivals. The carvings are in multiple languages, suggesting a sophisticated communication network among prisoners from different ethnic groups. The evidence of resistance challenges the narrative of passive victimization that dominates many historical accounts. Alexandra Falconbridge documented numerous rebellions at all three sites, noting that European officials lived in constant fear of coordinated uprisings. His medical records show that punishment for attempted rebellion was swift and brutal, designed to discourage others from similar attempts. At Gorée Island, French colonial records document over 200 escape attempts between 1740 and 1810. Most failed, but the persistence suggests that prisoners maintained hope and organizational capacity despite the conditions. Curator Eloy Coley explains that the island's geography made escape nearly impossible, but attempts continued nonetheless. The testimonies also revealed the spiritual resistance that helped some prisoners maintain their sanity. Islamic prisoners continued to pray, despite beatings. Traditional healers maintained their knowledge of medicinal plants. Storytellers passed down oral histories that preserved cultural memory. These practices, documented in fragmentary accounts, suggest that the dungeons became sites of cultural preservation as well as destruction. But perhaps the most important voices are those of the European witnesses who broke their silence. Dr. Alexander Falconbridge, initially hired to provide medical care for slave ships, eventually became one of the first European abolitionists after witnessing conditions in the dungeons. His detailed accounts of sexual violence, systematic torture, and deliberate killing provide corroborating evidence for African testimonies. Falconbridge's medical records, preserved in Liverpool archives, document the systematic use of violence as a tool of psychological control. The punishments, he wrote, were designed not just to discipline individuals, but to terrorize the entire population. Public beatings, sexual violence, and executions were performed in sight of other prisoners to ensure compliance. These voices from the darkness reveal a truth that official histories have consistently minimized. The dungeons weren't just holding areas for future slaves. They were laboratories for testing the limits of human endurance, workshops for destroying African identity, and training grounds for the systematic dehumanization that would define the plantation system across the Americas. Yet they also reveal the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. Even in conditions designed to break them completely, African prisoners found ways to maintain their humanity, preserve their cultures, and resist their captors. Their voices, long silenced by official narratives, are finally emerging from the darkness to tell the full story of what really happened in these secret dungeons. But the voices that remain most conspicuously absent from the historical record are those of the European officials, African collaborators, and Christian clergy who designed and operated this system. Their silence reveals perhaps the deepest truth of all. They knew exactly what they were doing. They understood the moral implications of their actions, and they chose to do it anyway, because the profits were simply too enormous to resist. And what those profits made possible in the cities and countries that grew wealthy from this trade would reshape the entire global economy in ways that persist to this day. The Economics of Human Misery. The letter arrived at Lloyd's of London on March 15, 1758, written on expensive paper and sealed with the crest of the Royal African Company. Inside, Cape Coast Castle's governor provided updates on the quarter's shipping schedules, market conditions, and expected profits. The language was clinical, businesslike, efficient. Cargo quality remains high, he wrote. Market demand continues strong. Projected returns exceed 40% on current investments. He was discussing human beings as if they were lumber or sugar or cotton, but this wasn't the aberrant behavior of a few corrupt officials. This was the systematic operation of what would become the world's most profitable industry, generating returns that would build entire cities, fund industrial revolutions, and create fortunes that persist to this day. The Royal African Company, operating from Cape Coast Castle, averaged 38% profit per voyage during the 1680s. These weren't modest gains from legitimate trade. These were astronomical returns from systematic human trafficking, made possible by the industrial-scale suffering in the dungeons below their headquarters. The scale was staggering. Cape Coast Castle alone exported approximately 70,000 enslaved Africans annually at peak operation. Elmina Castle processed up to 30,000. The House of Slaves on Goree Island, despite later academic debates about numbers, served as the administrative center for operations that shipped hundreds of thousands of people across the Atlantic. But the profits flowed far beyond West Africa. The economic integration was sophisticated and global. Mexican and Peruvian silver financed the purchase of enslaved Africans. Indian textiles were traded for human beings. Cowrie shells from the Maldives served as currency in African markets. Danish sugar refineries in the Caribbean depended on enslaved labor purchased through these dungeons. This wasn't a regional tragedy. It was a global economic system built on systematic torture. The financial records tell the story with devastating precision. Insurance policies from Lloyd's of London, preserved in their archives, document the systematic valuation of human cargo. Men were typically valued at £25 sterling. Women at £20, children at 15. These weren't estimates. They were precise calculations based on expected productivity, life expectancy, and market demand. The insurance policies also reveal another disturbing truth. The companies insuring slave ships calculated expected mortality rates with actuarial precision. They knew that approximately 30% of prisoners would die during transport, and they factored these losses into their premium calculations. Death wasn't an unfortunate side effect of the trade. It was a calculated business expense. The wealth generated from these dungeons transformed entire cities. Liverpool merchants invested slave trade profits in textile mills, ironworks, and shipbuilding. Bristol used profits from human trafficking to fund its expansion as a major port. In France, Nantes and Bordeaux developed entire industries around processing and shipping slave-produced commodities. By 1790, colonial commodities represented 72% of Hamburg's imports, most produced by enslaved labor purchased through West African dungeons. The profits weren't just significant by the standards of their time, they were transformative. The Royal African Company's profits from Cape Coast Castle operations helped capitalize England's early industrial development. Dutch profits from Elmina Castle funded Amsterdam's expansion as a major European financial center. French profits from Goree Island operations supported the expansion of colonial territories across 3 continents. The Danish West Indies provides perhaps the clearest example of how profits from these dungeons shaped global development. Despite representing only 1% of the Danish Empire's population, the islands contributed 5 to 6% of Denmark's total public revenue. This was wealth generated entirely by enslaved labor, purchased through West African dungeons, and transported in conditions that killed millions. The economic calculations were explicit. Plantation owners in the Caribbean and Americas calculated that it was more profitable to work enslaved people to death and buy replacements than to provide humane working conditions. This created constant demand for new captives, driving the expansion of the dungeon system along the West African coast. The financial mechanisms were equally sophisticated. European trading companies established credit systems that allowed plantation owners to purchase enslaved people on installment plans. Insurance companies developed specialized policies covering slave cargo. Banking houses created international exchange systems that facilitated payments across continents. The slave trade spawned an entire financial services industry. The profits also supported cultural and educational institutions that persist today. Universities in England, France, and the Americas received donations from slave trade profits. Churches built with slave trade money dot European cities. Art collections assembled with profits from human trafficking fill major museums. The cultural institutions that define European civilization were built, in part, on the systematic dehumanization that occurred in these West African dungeons. The scale of wealth transfer was unprecedented in human history. Estimates suggest that the Atlantic slave trade generated profits equivalent to several trillion dollars in contemporary currency. This wealth didn't disappear when slavery ended. It was invested in banks, industries, and institutions that continued to generate returns for centuries. The economic impact extended to Africa itself, but in ways that African societies never controlled or benefited from. European demand for enslaved people disrupted traditional economies, encouraged warfare between African states, and drained the continent of its most productive population. The Kingdom of Dahomey transformed itself into what historians call an efficient machine for warfare and enslavement, specifically to profit from European demand. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the economics was how completely it corrupted moral reasoning. European officials, Christian clergy, and African collaborators all found ways to justify systematic dehumanization because the profits were simply too large to ignore. The letters and diaries preserved in European archives reveal people who understood the moral implications of their actions, but chose to proceed anyway because the financial incentives were irresistible. The ledger books from Cape Coast Castle, preserved in Ghana's National Archives, provide chilling evidence of how completely human beings were reduced to economic calculations. Each page lists prices, quantities, and profit margins, as if documenting the sale of manufactured goods. The human reality of what these numbers represented is completely absent from the accounting. The economic system also created powerful political interests committed to maintaining the trade. Shipping companies, insurance firms, banks, and entire cities became dependent on profits from human trafficking. When abolition movements emerged in the late 18th century, they faced fierce opposition from established economic interests that had grown wealthy from the suffering in these dungeons. The wealth generated from these operations didn't just buy luxury goods or comfortable lifestyles. It capitalized the Industrial Revolution, funded colonial expansion, and created the financial foundations of the modern global economy. The dungeons of West Africa weren't just sites of human suffering. They were the profit centers of a global economic system that reshaped civilization itself. But the profits were only possible because of a complex network of collaborators that extended far beyond European officials and ship captains. African rulers, merchants, and military leaders were integral partners in the system, not merely its victims. And their willing participation in the systematic dehumanization of their own people reveals perhaps the darkest truth about the economics of human misery. The money was simply too good for anyone to refuse. The Collaborator Network. The letter arrived at Cape Coast Castle on September 12, 1820, written in English by someone who had clearly received a European education. The signature at the bottom read Ose Bonsu, Asante Hene, the king of the powerful Ashanti Empire. Inside, the African ruler responded to British pressure to end the slave trade with remarkable directness. "The white men who go to counsel with your master," Ose Bonsu wrote, "and pray to the great God for him, do not understand my country, or they would not say the slave trade was bad. But if they think it bad now, why did they think it good before? Is not your law an old law, the same as the Cramo law? These are Asante laws, made by our forefathers, and we have no other laws." This wasn't the desperate plea of a powerless victim forced into collaboration with European slavers. This was the calculated response of a sophisticated political leader defending a system that had made his kingdom wealthy and powerful. And it reveals perhaps the most uncomfortable truth about the slave dungeons of West Africa. They weren't simply European constructions imposed on unwilling African populations. They were joint ventures, operated by complex networks of African and European partners who found the profits too enormous to resist. Chief Caramansa's original agreement with the Portuguese to build Elmina Castle in 1482 established patterns of collaboration that would persist for centuries. The Portuguese needed local permission to construct their fortifications. African rulers needed European firearms to maintain power over rival kingdoms. The alliance was mutually beneficial, and it would eventually cost millions of African lives. The Ashanti Empire, formed around 1701, built its power specifically on the slave trade and European firearms. Archaeological evidence from Kumasi, the Ashanti capital, reveals warehouses filled with European weapons, textiles, and luxury goods, all purchased with enslaved people captured in raids against neighboring kingdoms. The Ashanti military machine was designed specifically to generate human cargo for the coastal dungeons. At Cape Coast Castle, British officials maintained detailed correspondence with African partners, preserved in the castle's archives. These letters reveal sophisticated business relationships between European companies and African rulers. Kings provided slaves captured in warfare. Europeans provided firearms, textiles, and alcohol. Both parties calculated profits with mercantile precision, and both understood exactly what they were trading. The collaboration extended to the operational level of the dungeons themselves. African guards, interpreters, and administrators worked directly for European companies. Some were enslaved people who had earned privileged positions through collaboration. Others were free Africans who found employment in the slave trade more profitable than traditional occupations. The dungeons couldn't have operated without extensive African participation. The Kingdom of Dahomey provides perhaps the clearest example of systematic African collaboration. Founded in the early 18th century, Dahomey transformed itself into what historian John Thornton calls an efficient machine for warfare and enslavement. The kingdom's famous female warriors, often romanticized in popular culture, were trained specifically to capture people for sale to European slavers. King Agaja of Dahomey's military campaigns were coordinated with European shipping schedules. His armies would conduct raids during specific seasons to ensure fresh captives were available when slave ships arrived at the coast. The coordination required sophisticated planning and communication between African kingdoms and European trading companies. Local judicial systems were deliberately corrupted to generate enslaved people for trade. According to historian Akosua Purby's research at the University of Ghana, African courts began criminalizing behaviors that had previously been considered minor infractions, sentencing offenders to slavery rather than traditional punishments. Adultery, theft, and even debt became capital crimes punishable by sale to European slavers. The corruption extended to religious institutions. Traditional priests, Islamic scholars, and Christian converts all found ways to justify or profit from the slave trade. Some religious leaders provided spiritual justification for enslaving people from rival ethnic groups. Others participated directly in the trade, selling people accused of witchcraft or religious crimes to European buyers. At Goree Island, the collaboration took different forms. Senegalese merchants, known as signaries, often women of mixed African and European ancestry, served as intermediaries between European companies and African suppliers. They managed networks that extended hundreds of miles into the interior, coordinating the capture and transport of enslaved people to coastal dungeons. The signaries accumulated enormous wealth through their participation in the slave trade. They owned ships, warehouses, and residential compounds that rivaled European facilities in luxury and sophistication. Their success depended entirely on their ability to deliver human cargo to European buyers, and they approached this work with entrepreneurial efficiency. The linguistic evidence reveals the depth of African collaboration. Words for slave trading, punishment, and human bondage entered multiple West African languages during this period, suggesting that the concepts became normalized parts of local cultures. The languages adapted to accommodate the systematic dehumanization that the trade required. The collaboration wasn't limited to political and economic elites. Ordinary Africans found employment as guides, translators, guards, and laborers in the slave trade system. Archaeological evidence from around Cape Coast Castle reveals that the local population grew significantly during the 18th century as people migrated to the area, seeking employment in the expanding trade. Some African collaborators accumulated sufficient wealth to send their children to European schools. The archives of several British universities contain records of students from slave trading families. These young people received European educations funded by profits from human trafficking, then returned to Africa to expand their families' participation in the trade. The collaboration also included military cooperation. African kingdoms provided soldiers to help European companies suppress rebellions in the dungeons. When prisoners attempted to escape or organize resistance, African and European forces worked together to recapture fugitives and punish rebels. The dungeons were secured by multinational forces with shared economic interests. The moral compromises required for this collaboration produced complex psychological adaptations. Letters and diaries from African collaborators reveal people who developed elaborate justifications for their participation in systematic dehumanization. They convinced themselves that they were saving captives from worse fates, bringing them into contact with European civilization, or following divine commands to punish enemies. But the collaboration also created profound social tensions within African communities. Archaeological evidence suggests that slave trading areas experienced significant population displacement as people fled regions where collaboration with European slavers was common. The trade created refugee populations, internal conflicts, and cultural disruptions that persisted long after the dungeons were closed. The economic incentives for collaboration were simply overwhelming. European traders offered firearms that could determine the outcome of military conflicts. They provided textiles, alcohol, and luxury goods that became symbols of political power. They offered employment opportunities that were more lucrative than traditional occupations. For individuals, families, and entire kingdoms, collaboration with the slave trade offered paths to wealth and influence that no other economic system could match. The collaboration networks were also remarkably resilient. When Britain officially abolished the slave trade in 1807, many African partners simply shifted their operations to work with Spanish, Portuguese, or American buyers. The relationships established during centuries of legal slave trading provided the foundation for decades of illegal trafficking that continued until the 1870s. The legacy of collaboration persists in contemporary West African societies in ways that remain politically sensitive. Descendants of slave trading families still hold positions of political and economic influence. Traditional rulers whose ancestors accumulated wealth through human trafficking continue to exercise authority in their communities. The historical truth about African collaboration remains a source of tension in modern political discourse. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the collaboration was how completely it normalized systematic dehumanization. African societies that had maintained complex moral and legal systems found ways to justify enslaving their neighbors, selling their prisoners, and collaborating with foreigners in the systematic destruction of African lives. The slave trade didn't just extract people from Africa, it corrupted the moral foundations of African societies themselves. But understanding this collaboration is essential to understanding how the dungeons operated and why they persisted for so long. These weren't simply European impositions on African societies. They were joint ventures, operated by networks of African and European partners who found the profits from systematic dehumanization too enormous to resist. The evidence of resistance within this system becomes even more remarkable when understood against the background of such extensive collaboration. Despite the economic incentives, political pressures, and cultural adaptations that encouraged participation in the slave trade, some Africans chose to resist. And their stories, preserved in the archaeological record and fragmentary documentary sources, provide evidence of moral courage that survived even the most corrupting influences.